Welcome back to CIA Declassified. Picture a room draped in heavy red velvet and dark mahogany, thick with the smell of tobacco and the weight of 1,000 years of Russian history. You are inside the Kremlin, Moscow. The year is 1974. A group of men, mostly in their late 60s and 70s, sit around a massive table. These are the members of the Politburo in Russian, or as most people speak it in English, Politburo. Their faces are stone, their suits are drab, and their power is absolute. But outside this room, in the clandestine offices of the CIA's Office of Strategic Research, psychologists are looking past the medals and the titles. They are looking at the cracks in the collective psyche. You lean forward, catching the glint of tea glasses and silver holders and the dust motes dancing in the dim light of heavy chandeliers. Every time a senior member speaks, you notice the subtle, almost mechanical shift in the posture of the men flanking him, a synchronized leaning in that signals total, unquestioning alignment. It is a choreographed dance of survival. There is a coldness that seeps through the floorboards, a reminder that in the sanctuary of high socialism, the warmth of human spontaneity has been surgically removed to make room for the party line. You can almost feel the phantom weight of the general secretary's gaze, a pressure that turns a simple nod into a life or death commitment. You are witnessing the birth of a different kind of surveillance. It isn't about satellites or wiretaps, it's about cognitive mapping. You feel the oppressive air of the era, the Brezhnev stagnation, where loyalty to the party line is the only currency. In this environment, a dissenting opinion isn't just a mistake. It's a death sentence for a career. You are part of the team at Langley, tasked with figuring out what happens when a superpower is led by a committee that has forgotten how to disagree. The atmosphere is charged with the tension of the nuclear trigger, the terrifying reality that a single lapse in group logic could ignite the world. As you move through the simulation rooms in Virginia, you are surrounded by behavioral analysts who treat the Soviet leadership like a single multi-headed organism. You can practically hear the scratch of pens on legal pads as they track the nodding reflex of the junior members. You are immersed in a world where the silent majority of the committee is more dangerous than the vocal hawks. The setting is one of intense intellectual isolation. The analysts are trying to bridge the gap between two worlds that speak different languages of logic. It is a psychological autopsy performed on a living government, a search for the stress point where the collective will finally snaps. This is the world of Project DOREA. You aren't just observing, you are calculating the entropy of leadership. You watch as the psychologists build decision trees based on the paranoid history of the Soviet Union. The silence of the Kremlin is a facade. Beneath it is a frantic scramble for self-preservation that dictates global policy. You are standing at the intersection of psychology and statecraft, where the most important question isn't what will they do, but who will be the first to blink. Why the name? Within the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence, Project DOREA was a uniquely evocative choice. While most project names were generated by a randomized computer list, DOREA is believed to be derived from the Latinized Greek word for gift, specifically the gift of insight. Records from the period suggest it was an operation of analysis, a formal project dedicated to the psychological profiling of the nomenclatura. It got its name because the analysts believed that understanding the internal groupthink of the Soviets would be the ultimate gift to U.S. negotiations during the SALT talks. It was an invention of policy, a realization that human behavior was as critical a variable as missile counts. If you want to understand why a Politburo member never says no, you don't read their manifesto. You read the sweat on their palms. So let's pull back the curtain on the cold clinical data of this psychological autopsy. Project DOREA was initiated in 1967 following the sudden rise of Leonid Brezhnev. The project utilized content analysis of every public speech made by Politburo members to track cognitive decline. It was overseen by the CIA's Psychological Services Division. DOREA researchers identified the gerontocracy effect, the impact of aging and illness on Soviet decision-making. The project utilized proxemic analysis to study the physical distance between leaders in official photos. It utilized the Delphi method to gain consensus among US experts on Soviet behavior. DOREA was deployed to predict the Soviet reaction to the Prague Spring in 1968. The project utilized biographic files that included the medical histories of every Soviet minister. It identified targeted fears of the Soviet elite, such as the fear of a revived Germany. DOREA utilized game theory to simulate the Politburo's response to US naval movements. The project was active in monitoring the power struggles between the military and the KGB. It utilized remote assessment techniques developed for profiling world leaders. DOREA was utilized to monitor the group dynamics of the 24th Party Congress. The project documented the alcoholism rates among high-level Soviet officials. It utilized social network analysis to map the patron-client relationships in Moscow. DOREA was integrated into the National Intelligence Estimates. The project monitored the internal memos leaked from the Soviet Central Committee. It utilized psycholinguistics to detect when a leader was speaking under duress or party pressure. DOREA identified the decision paralysis that occurred during the Yom Kippur War. The project utilized historical analogies to predict if the Soviets would repeat past mistakes. It identified the vulnerability of the Soviet system to sudden charismatic leadership. DOREA was utilized to track the ideological purity test used within the Kremlin. The project documented the sleep deprivation of leaders during international crisis. It utilized cultural intelligence to understand the Russian soul versus the Soviet mind. DOREA was a primary source for the briefing books of US presidents from Johnson to Reagan. Analysts tracked the slurring patterns in Brezhnev's speech to determine the onset of heavy sedation. DOREA identified that table shape in Soviet satellite countries was altered to mimic the Kremlin's hierarchy. The project discovered that junior members would often hold their breath when a senior member became angry. DOREA predicted the Soviet failure in Afghanistan based on the yes man feedback loop in the military. Analysts used shadow mapping on parade footage to determine which leaders had lost weight, indicating illness. The project documented a suicide pact mentality during the Able Archer 83 exercise. DOREA tracked the consumption of Western heart medications smuggled into the Kremlin. The project found that humor was used by junior officials as a secret metric for dissent. CIA psychologists identified that the Politburo viewed compromise as a clinical symptom of weakness. DOREA noted that Soviet leaders who stayed at their dachas during crisis were often being psychologically frozen out. The project utilized scent analysis from intercepted clothing to detect high levels of stress hormones. DOREA identified that the order of clapping at party congresses was strictly regulated by rank. Analysts discovered a secret second language of eye contact used to communicate fear between ministers. The project found that Soviet groupthink was most intense on Tuesdays, the traditional day for a Politburo meeting. DOREA researchers used lip sync software, early versions, to overhear whispers in the background of state TV. The project documented that the average age of the Politburo increased by 1 year for every year they were in power. DOREA identified that Soviet leaders were terrified of modern computers because they might prove the party was wrong. The project mapped the genealogical fear passed down from the Stalinist purges. Analysts used gait analysis to determine if a leader was suffering from Parkinson's disease. DOREA discovered that chess grandmasters were often consulted by the Politburo to validate their paranoia. The project found that the Soviet leadership believed the US was psychically attacking them. DOREA identified that silence in a meeting was often recorded in the official minutes as unanimous agreement. Analysts tracked the sugar consumption of the elite to monitor diabetes-related mood swings. The project discovered that the Politburo had a special phone that only rang if someone was about to be fired. DOREA identified that Soviet leaders never looked each other in the eye while voting. The project found that the nodding reflex was so strong, some members did it in their sleep. Analysts use infrared photography to detect the blushing of members during intense interrogation. DOREA documented that paranoia was considered an official job requirement for the KGB head. The project discovered the Politburo used astrologers despite being officially atheistic. DOREA identified that the most powerful man in the room was often the one who spoke the least. A declassified DOREA analysts report dated 1971, the Politburo is not a collection of individuals but a machine for the reproduction of the status quo. A declassified internal CIA memo on the goals of DOREA. We are looking for the one honest man in a system that rewards the 1,000 yes men. Declassified file or excerpt from the DOREA field manual. To understand the Soviet Union, you must understand the fear of being the only person in the room not clapping. Declassified 1975 CIA behavioral study on the Soviet Council of Ministers. The collective leadership structure acts as a heat sink for accountability. When everyone is responsible, no one is. And then this is a quote that's attributed to a senior CIA psychologist during a briefing on Soviet stagnation, but it doesn't say their name. Groupthink is the silent killer of empires. And a declassified intelligence summary for the National Security Council. Our profiles suggest that Brezhnev's primary drive is no longer expansion, but the avoidance of any internal friction that might reveal his own physical frailty. And a declassified Directorate of Intelligence memo on Project DOREA findings. The psychological isolation of the Soviet leadership has reached a point where they are more concerned with their own internal consensus than with the reality of the external world. Within the final psychological synthesis of the DOREA Politburo study, a massive 165 pages titled Controlled Destabilization and Personality Exploitation, are entirely blacked out. These redactions are protected under Exemption B1 for national security. I suspect these pages detail the direct intervention protocols, specific methods for using psychological nudges or misinformation to trigger a groupthink crisis within the Kremlin. I think the redacted portions cover induced paranoia, techniques for making specific leaders believe their peers were plotting against them to shatter the committee's unity. And I think that some of the redactions likely also hide the Brezhnev incapacitation plan, the psychological profile used to determine how much US pressure would cause the Soviet leader to suffer a mental or physical breakdown during the height of the Cold War. And I'm not the only one with theories. In a room where everyone agrees, the truth is the first thing to go missing. There's the puppet master theory. It's a persistent one that claims that Project DOREA successfully identified a way to hypnotize the collective Politburo through specific frequencies in radio broadcast. Then there is the Andropov infiltration speculation. Some believe the project was so successful that it allowed the CIA to psychologically recruit Yuri Andropov, turning the head of the KGB into a secret asset. Then there's the doomsday groupthink theory. Fringe speculators suggest that the CIA discovered the Politburo had entered a death pact where they would all agree to a nuclear launch if even one member suggested it. And then there is the simulated Kremlin conspiracy. Conspiracy enthusiasts whisper that the CIA built a full-scale exact replica of the Politburo's meeting room in Virginia, populated by mental clones who began to think and react exactly like the real Soviet leaders. Was DOREA a success? Tactically, it was a map of the enemy's soul. It was a success because it gave U.S. diplomats the upper hand in every negotiation. It allowed them to know exactly which buttons to push and which threats would be taken seriously. It turned soft science into a hard asset of the intelligence community. It proved that a well-placed psychological observation was worth more than 10 spy satellites. It was the tactical breakthrough of predictive diplomacy, allowing the White House to steer through the Cuban Missile Crisis and later detente by knowing exactly how much Soviet leadership's collective fear of embarrassment outweighed their desire for expansion. Strategically, it was the subtle unraveling of the tapestry of the Iron Curtain. DOREA was an unqualified success because it allowed the U.S. to transition from a strategy of containment to one of psychological displacement. By understanding the inherent brittleness of Soviet groupthink, the U.S. was also able to engage in information operations that targeted the specific insecurities of the elite. It shifted the focus of the Cold War from the battlefield to the boardroom, forcing the Soviets into a reactive stance they were psychologically ill-equipped to handle. Furthermore, DOREA's strategic value manifested in the long-term degradation of ideological certainty. By identifying and exploiting the gaps in Politburo logic, the CIA successfully fostered an environment where the Soviet leadership became increasingly paralyzed by their own internal contradictions. This strategic victory didn't just win a single battle. It prepared the ground for the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union from within. The legacy of DOREA is the realization that if you can control the way an adversary thinks about their options, you have already won the conflict before a single shot is fired. It proved that the most durable walls aren't made of concrete, but of the shared delusions of men in power. The operational and technological breakthroughs born from the echo chamber changed the landscape of human oversight forever. Groupthink vulnerability assessment was the primary operational breakthrough, engineered to identify the tipping point where a committee loses its ability to think critically. For humanity today, this logic powers corporate governance audits and crisis management training, ensuring that boards of directors don't fall into the same traps as the Politburo. The military applies this to red teaming, where specialized units challenge every assumption in battle plans to avoid fatal tunnel vision. Meanwhile, the intelligence community uses it to monitor the fragility of rival regimes, predicting exactly when a government's internal consensus will buckle under the weight of a revolution. Remote personality profiling represents a monumental technological breakthrough refined to create accurate behavioral models from public data. For humanity today, this is the foundational technology for AI personality simulations and the predictive analytics used by recruiters to find leaders who can resist peer pressure. The military uses these profiles for hostage negotiation and counterinsurgency, tailoring their approach to the specific mental state of an adversary. In the intelligence world, this allows for the remote assessment of nuclear-armed world leaders, providing a mental health early warning system that informs the President of the United States on how to de-escalate without losing ground. Ideological echo chamber analysis was an operational breakthrough developed to understand how information is filtered and distorted in closed societies. For humanity today, this powers the algorithm audits used to study social media polarization and to find ways to pop digital filter bubbles that threaten democracy. The military applies this to information warfare and psychological operations, identifying the specific narratives that will disrupt enemy command chains from within. The intelligence community utilizes it for counter-radicalization, mapping out the psychological paths that lead individuals into extremist ideologies and developing off-ramps based on the DOREA models of ideological dissent. Cognitive load modeling served as a sophisticated technological breakthrough created to determine the exact moment a decision maker will crack under intense pressure. For humanity today, this technology has migrated into aviation safety and nuclear power control rooms designed to prevent human error during catastrophic failures. The military applies it to pilot endurance and special forces selection, ensuring that those in control of high-stakes weaponry can maintain clarity during the fog of war. The intelligence community utilizes it for strategic deception, timing the release of misinformation to hit an adversary at the precise moment their cognitive load is at its peak, effectively inducing a state of analysis paralysis. The echoes of the Kremlin's Red Room continue to vibrate through every high-level meeting in the world today. It was an era that proved that the most dangerous form of silence is the one born of agreement. The result was a world where the collective will could be both a superpower's shield and its undoing. The legacy of the DOREA project is written in the way we now look at leadership, not as a collection of titles, but as a fragile web of human psychology. As we move into an era of AI and automated decision-making, the lessons of the echo chamber are more relevant than ever. In the end, the project taught us that the greatest secret of all isn't a launch code. It's the reason why the man sitting next to you is nodding his head. We must recognize that the gift of DOREA was a double-edged sword. It gave us the vision to see through the enemy's mask, but it also revealed the terrifying truth that our own systems are equally prone to the gravity of the herd. The shadow of the Politburo table stretches long into the 21st century, reminding us that the most impenetrable fortress is the one built out of 1,000 small, silent compromises. To truly learn from the echo chamber is to understand that the survival of our species may well depend on our willingness to be the only one in the room who refuses to clap. What haunts us now isn't the ghost of the Kremlin, but the realization that the echo chamber is no longer confined to wood-paneled rooms in Moscow. It's in our pockets, our feeds, and our very homes. DOREA proved that the mind is the ultimate theater of war, and that the most effective cage is the one we help build for one another through our desperate need of belonging. We are all, in some small way, sitting at that red velvet table, waiting for the General Secretary to speak so we can finally start nodding. If everyone in the room is nodding, it's time to leave the room. The truth is usually found in the person who is afraid to speak. Never mistake a committee's consensus for a logical conclusion. And remember, the echo is only loud because the room is empty of dissent. Thanks for listening, and join us next time as we examine MK Wrong, the brutal operations to discredit foreign leaders by staging scandals. We'll look at the honeypot traps of the 1960s, the fake evidence factories of the Cold War, and the reality of a world where a reputation can be destroyed with a single well-placed lie. Join us next time for the architecture of the slur. In the meantime, I'll see you in the archives.